Wow. That was a pretty good preamble, too. I felt really good about that preamble. All for there just to just not be sound. That's awesome. You don't know how happy that makes me. Give me 1 second. Yeah, the software I use, I guess, just decided it didn't want to register my mic as the audio input capture. It went back to default, which is nothing. Nothing takes it. So, yeah, that sucks. Because I felt very good about that preamble. But alas, it was nothing important. It was just me talking about Age of Empires. And yeah, that was about it. Pretty much just Age of Empires. Well, no, it wasn't just Age of Empires, because I gave the whole spiel about what we read last week. Belisarius reconquering Italy from Amalasuntha and Theodahad and Witiges. And that's all gone. And now y'all are left wondering, what exactly was it that I said? But oh well, that's just for me to know now, because I ain't doing it again. That's a joke. I'm going to partially do it again. So 534. Amalasuntha, her son dies. She becomes queen regent of Italy. She decides to rule alongside her cousin Theodahad, who betrays her, imprisons her on an island, and then murders her. So great guy, Theodahad. What's funny about that is Theodahad is a pacifist. Pacifist about war, but not about murdering his cousin. Great guy. And then, so he's the sole ruler of Italy. And then his troops lose the siege of Naples. Naples is reconquered by Belisarius. And Theodahad is overthrown by Witiges and executed. 357 and 358, or 537 and 538, Belisarius has reconquered Rome and is defending Rome from Witiges' numerically superior army. And he is rescued by a Byzantine force in March 538. 539, they march on Ravenna, which is where Witiges is holed up. And through some devious treachery, Belisarius is granted entrance into Ravenna, and he captures Witiges and sends him and a bunch of his retinue, to the east to Justinian as prisoners. And then, so that was what we went over last week, plus we started getting into the administrative reforms of Justinian's reign. The administrative governmental reforms. All right. Now that y'all can hear me again, we can actually start reading again. Awesome. Justinian's passion for order and uniformity found a more successful outlet in the abstract sphere of legislation. The task before him was enormous, and the achievement, considering the difficulties encountered, a very notable one. Roman law consisted of two masses, which were usually distinguished as Old Law, Jus Vetus, and New Law, Jus Novum. The Old Law consisted principally of the statutes of the Republic and early Empire, the decrees of the Senate during the same period, and the comments of contemporary jurists. These formed a vast conglomeration. Some of them were inaccessible, others had become obsolete. and there were numerous discrepancies and contradictions. Yeah, normally you're the one having trouble hearing, and so if you can hear, we know for a fact that my microphone actually works now. This is awesome. Well, what's funny is I can see my microphone working because it's got one of those little thingies, one of those mixers that shows you that you have input. And I wasn't even paying attention. I talked for a solid 5 minutes before Mulberry pointed out, "Hey, I can't hear you." So sweet. But I digress. One jurist might be quoted against another, and no judge or lawyer could feel sure that some obscure opinion might not be produced against him in court which would upset his arguments. The new law comprised the ordinances of the emperors in subsequent times. Here, too, there were uncertainties. One decree might repeal another, and no complete collection of the decrees had yet been made. But it was an easier problem than the other, and so in 528, the year after his accession, Justinian began his great work by appointing a commission of 10 to go through the Jus Novum, removing contradictions and redundancies, and gathering the most valuable part of the rest into one volume of 10 books. This was the famous Codex Justianus, and its success encouraged the emperor to proceed to the Jus Vetus, the old law. A new commission was appointed in 530 to deal with the enormous mass of literature involved, which consisted of no less than 2,000 treatises. Out of the writings of all the recognized jurists, one statement of the law on each point was to be selected, and the expressions of the author were to be changed wherever clearness demanded it or the requirements of the time. The results of this process were the 50 books which comprise what are known as the Digest or Pandects, the most remarkable and important law book that the world has ever seen, both in itself and in the influence it has exercised on all subsequent legislation. It is open to criticism in several respects. The work was done in haste, and the arrangement is by no means ideal. It is not, properly speaking, a codification, a reduction of previous laws to an organic system. It is more like some of the buildings of the time, where the delicate moldings and reliefs of an earlier age are thrust in among coarse rubble and hasty brickwork, to serve as common stones in the clumsy fabric. In the time of her greatness, Rome found her most perfect aesthetic expression in the art of legislation and the elegance of her legal formulae. The brilliance of her solutions have never been surpassed. The jurists of the 6th century were not content merely to abstract from their illustrious predecessors. Subtle interpretations were misunderstood and in consequence perverted. Essential phraseology was cut and mutilated. Hellenistic and Oriental conceptions were introduced into the Roman system. The Greeks introducing Hellenistic concepts to Roman law? Unheard of. The Greeks introducing Greek stuff into Roman stuff? Crazy. I don't know why they would do that. It's not as if the most important thing that they thought about themselves was that they were Greek. These defects were perhaps inevitable. A more perfect redaction could not have been accomplished in the time and under the conditions of Justinian's reign. As it stands, it is the complete expression of the period. In its insistence on the Latin language and the Latin heritage, in its doctrines of imperial absolutism, it looks back to the long roll of Caesars. In its increased humanity, its recognition of the rights of the individual, it checks on the patria potestas. It records the long progress of ancient thought, and the influence of the Church is plainly visible in the increasing severity of laws concerning divorce and sexual offenses. Base, divorce is bad? Heck yeah. In order to complete his legislative work, Justinian published the Institutes, an elementary textbook for the use of students. Legal education was also reorganized, and detailed regulations were issued for the 3 great universities of Rome, Constantinople, and Beirut. Now, This, one thing about doing this that will help me is geography, because I don't know where Beirut is. Lebanon, yeah. Okay, I wasn't sure. Yeah. No, just give me Beirut. Don't give me all the stuff in Beirut. Yeah, Beirut, Lebanon. Neat. Yeah. Beirut. It's right there. So the three great schools were in Rome, Constantinople. On the map here, it will be Istanbul. But I like calling it Istanbul just because it annoys the Greek people. It annoys the Greeks, but I also don't like the Ottomans in any way, shape, or form. So I really don't know what to call it. It's like, I like the Greeks more than I like the Ottomans, so yeah, I guess we will default to Constantinople. I like Constantine. Constantine was a good guy. Big fan of Constantine. But yeah, so the three great universities, talks about Rome, Istanbul, Beirut, Lebanon. That's right above Israel. And then you have the West Bank and Gaza. Oh yeah, so this little country right here, I couldn't figure out the name of it. That's just Armenia. Last time we did a little Google Earth thing, I was thinking Yerevan. What is that? It's just Armenia. Just Armenia. Armenia is a good country. A lot of Catholics there. A lot of good Catholics there. Here's Georgia. Here's Atlanta. This is where all of the Dodge Chargers are sent to, so I've been told. I don't know where the Georgia Bulldogs play here, but get it? It's Georgia, so I'm making Georgia jokes. What's this? But anyway, yeah. Shall we go to Ecuador again? Yeah, let's get distracted by Ecuador again. Yeah, all right. Cool. Geography. We love geography. Geography adds so much context to things I didn't know needed context. Nothing was to be left to chance or change. No further commentaries were allowed. Translations must be strictly literal. Only to the emperor himself was further legislation permitted, and it is curiously ironical that in spite of the insistence on Latin as the official language, most of these latter laws are written in Greek, that they may be better understood of the people, while no penalties could prevent the appearance of a flood of Greek paraphrases of the immutable Pandects and constitutions. That, I think, is just kind of dumb. Latin as the official language of law just makes sense for the same reason that it makes sense that it is the liturgical language. Back then, probably it was different, but Latin because it's a dead language, the words don't evolve. They will always mean the same thing. Having Latin as the language of law makes sense. But back then, 530 or so, Latin was still spoken pretty consistently, I guess. I guess Greek was the language of Constantinople, obviously. Latin was still probably spoken in Italy. So it's not a dead language at that point. But looking back, yeah, it would have been better. Looking back on it, it makes sense that Latin would be the language of law. Just like the language of liturgy. In the West, the direct influence of Justinian's legal code was hardly felt. Roman law was known mainly through the code which Alaric, the Visigoth king, had produced some 30 years earlier, a practical compilation for the use of his people in Gaul and Spain, in which the simpler of the Roman legal conceptions were skillfully harmonized with the conditions of the time and the tribal customs of the Goths. It was not until the 11th century that Justinian's code began to be studied systematically in Provence, Lombardy, Ravenna, and Bologna. Ooh, I want me some bologna. But Roman law made itself felt not only in the regions containing a predominantly Romanized population, but also wherever the growth of trade, the claims of the church, or the revival of legal thought demanded nicer distinctions and more logical categories. It became, in later times, a powerful weapon in the hands of an ambitious prince or grasping bishop, seeking to override the limitations of feudalism by assuming the absolute prerogatives of a Justinian. Yeah, powerful weapon in the hands. Neat. I wish I understood this phrase a little better. Seeking to override the limitations of feudalism by assuming the absolute prerogatives of a Justinian. I guess something about absolute authority? Oh, okay. Here, I guess we're going to explain it in the next paragraph. Always read ahead before you try to figure something out. Normally the answer is there. The absolutism in question found perhaps its most striking expression in the ecclesiastical sphere, where it resulted in what has sometimes been called Caesaropapism. Very simple to understand. Caesar and papism. The king being the head of the church. Henry VIII. I assume, at least. I don't know that for a fact, but logically, that's what makes sense to me. Justinian was not content to regulate the church by detailed legislation. In doctrinal disputes, he exerted to the full his imperial prerogatives of convoking councils and assigning limits. Imperial ministers presided, messengers hurried to and fro from the palace, and if the decision were in doubt, the emperor would occasionally intervene in person. Though formally distinct, church and state were actually one, and political considerations guided Justinian along the road into which his theological interests had already led him. As they should. Foremost among these considerations was the unity of his empire, and this was to be obtained by two means, force and conciliation. The treatment accorded to heretics illustrates both methods and furnishes at the same time an example of the way in which politics and dogma intermingled in the imperial policy. In theory, the heretic had forfeited all rights, public and private. It is just, said the emperor, to deprive of their worldly goods those who do not worship the true God. In practice, there were many distinctions and degrees. Politically insignificant heresies could be crushed. For Manichees, death was the only punishment. Usually they were burnt alive. Paganism, for the most part, a dwindling remnant of scattered superstitions, was severely handled. In isolated valleys and lonely hill towns, the old beliefs still lingered. At Baalbek, immemorial rites were still celebrated in the temple, and in the Libyan desert, Jupiter Ammon still gave his oracles, though he had at this time retired to a more inaccessible oasis, where he was worshipped in company with Alexander, now become a god. This shrine was transformed into the Church of St. Mary. Based. Let's go. And the Temple of Isis at Philae, on the Nubian border was also made into a Christian center. Let's go. You built a pagan shrine out in the middle of nowhere? That's a church now. That's a church now. That's a Christian shrine. Oh, you want to worship Jupiter and Alexander the Great? Nah. Church dedicated to Mary. Get wrecked. Pagans. Love them. A lot of our culture, a lot of the Roman, we get a lot of Roman culture. Roman culture was pagan until it was Christianized. I agree with Chesterton that there's a certain amount of respect, I guess you could say, but we have reverence for our ancestors. We don't worship our ancestors, but we have reverence for them. And so there's a certain amount of reverence we almost have to have for the old pagans, especially the ones who were not because they were pagans and worshipped, but they're our ancestors and they didn't know better to some degree. Especially the ones before Christianity came to be. But there's a certain respect that we kind of have for them. They're good stories. The Greek myths are fun. So I harbor no ill will towards the pagans, unless they were, the child sacrificing ones. Then lots of ill will, because you kind of have two sects of paganism. You have the devil worshippers, and then you have the nature worshippers. The nature worshippers, very obviously, are superior in almost every way to the child murderers and the devil worshippers. And that's kind of what the Punic Wars were kind of a war between the nature worshippers and the devil worshippers. Rome, its mythology is very similar in a lot of ways to the Greek mythology. I think it descends from it. But for Rome, it was a very natural religion. They worshipped pretty much everything, anything and everything. The rivers, the streams, they looked out and they saw gods plural everywhere, which is more respectable than demon worship, obviously. But the Punic Wars against Carthage were pretty much that. Nature worship versus demon worship. Nature worship won. And that paved the way for worship of God, worship of He who is all, the omnipresent, omniscient God, the God who is everything, who is all-encompassing. Because worshiping nature. If you're not in a situation where you are able to be taught the truth, it makes sense because the idea of worship is so ingrained in our being. It makes sense that the most common type of worship is nature worship. There are many, many different pagans in Africa, Europe, the East, Asia, even in America. Nature worship, worship of the sun, worship of the moon, that's all definitely the most common. Of course, you have your big ones. You have your big devil worshippers, the Aztecs, the worshippers of Baal, Moloch. Yeah, I have a lot more respect for the nature worshippers because I like nature. I like the beauty of nature. This is the beauty that God has given us. Let's admire it for that sake, for His sake. We know it is not God, but There are aspects of God in nature, and as intelligent beings, we can discern those and we can appreciate it. And as stewards of the earth, we can preserve it. But nature also works for us, and we need to work with nature to better ourselves, to better our planet, our society. Nature is here for us, not only to look at, but also to use. This is all just a roundabout way of getting back to me complaining about the national park systems killing our lumber industry. but let's get away from that and then move back into paganism. Paganism still had its adherents among the educated classes, and stringent laws were accordingly directed against them. They might not inherit or enter into contracts. They were debarred from holding any office except those which were in themselves a penalty, like the curia. An inquisition at Constantinople discovered a number of distinguished pagans, including university teachers and doctors. Many of them were scourged and imprisoned. In Palestine, the Jews had lost their center of revolt and submitted, under protest, to the regulation by imperial decree of their text of the Scriptures. But the Samaritans, goaded by excessive taxes and Christian persecution, broke into riot on their hilltops and were almost exterminated by severe punitive measures. In the West, political considerations were even more apparent. The Donatists in Africa were deprived of their property and churches. They had been in league with the anti-imperial forces. The Arian clergy were solidly organized, and Justinian would have allowed them to remain on condition that they embraced the Orthodox faith. But the hatred of the Catholics, who had suffered much from them, was implacable, and these latter were supported by the Pope. Justinian accordingly acceded to their demands for vengeance. In Italy, other causes favored the spoliation of the Arian churches. Their Gothic sympathies were an excuse, their great riches an incentive to the hand of the spoiler. Yeah, so harsh treatment of heretics, for non-Christians, it seems harsh, but heresy is kind of a harsh thing, especially if you have a Catholic country. You need to make sure that it remains Catholic. You don't want to be promoting people who aren't Catholic, especially from a government standpoint. If your government is Catholic and your government wants to align with the church. That was the reason for the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition actually was more to kind of tame Isabella, because she was kind of, I would say she was a little too gung-ho about it, and maybe some innocent people died, maybe some didn't. But the Spanish Inquisition kind of toned down the severity of the trials, because the Spanish Inquisition was more to root out the false converts, the false Jewish and Moorish converts, after the Reconquista was finished in 1492. If Isabella kind of went after them severely, the Moriscos, and there was another name for the false Jewish converts in Spain, but she was very harsh with them. And I'm not saying that's not justified, but the Dominicans kind of stepped in to kind of help make sure that these people who she was prosecuting were actually false converts. That way, innocent people didn't get locked up. Was it 100% success rate? Probably not. Were innocent people still probably sent out of the country, or maybe in a couple of circumstances executed? Probably. You can't, it's hard to, there's probably a good bit of people who that happened to. The probably a few people who were accused of it, but you can't have it's very hard to have a 100% success rate on it. But where this the Spanish Inquisition going around and murdering people just because they thought, oh, you might be a heretic, so we're just going to burn you at the stake. It's like, no, that's not at all what happened. They were there to kind of tone down to, what's the word, encourage charity to our brother heretics. Who, a friend of mine was telling me that the Donatists, speaking of them, there was the saints who were working against the Donatists our saints, the Catholic ones who weren't heretics, they would refer to them as their brothers very purposefully, because they consider them fallen away brothers, and so kind of prodigal son types. Yeah, they're heretics, but they're our brothers, and we have to try to get them back. And so yeah, it was the Spanish Inquisition was more of a charity thing than bloodlust, like it's portrayed. Yeah, this type of thing, the kind of harsher treatment of the heretics. Yeah, I don't have too much of an issue with it, as long as they're not, murdering people. It's a Catholic nation. You gotta be Catholic. The Monophysites were on an entirely different footing. Up until 541, they are called the Hesitants, and Justinian reasoned with them as erring brethren. Sterner measures followed, but conciliation was always in view. The problem was fundamental to the safety of the empire. On one side were the prosperous and powerful Monophysite cities in Egypt and Asia Minor, the backbone of the imperial budget. On the other was the Catholic opposition at Constantinople, and above all, the Pope, supported by the great majority of the Western bishops. To retain the allegiance of the East, already threatened by conflicting interests and national animosities, without losing the support of the newly conquered West, was a difficult, possibly a hopeless task. At all events, Justinian's complicated policy was not unworthy of a great emperor. In this policy, he was ably seconded by Theodora, whose Monophysite sympathies were well known. The early years of his reign showed that he was prepared to recede from the extreme Catholic position taken up by Justin. Real quick, context, just so the Monophysite heresy. Let's see. So it claimed that Christ was one person with only one nature, a fusion of human and divine elements. They are thus known as Monophysites because of their claim that Christ had only one nature. Orthodox Catholic theologians recognize that Monophysitism was as bad as Nestorianism because it denied Christ's full humanity and full divinity. If Christ did not have a fully human nature, then he would not be fully human. And if he did not have a fully divine nature, then he was not fully divine. So it was a reaction to Nestorianism, it seems, which was a heresy against Mary, but also against Christ. See, it was initiated by Nestorius, Bishop of Constantinople, who denied Mary the title of Theotokos, which in Greek is the God-bearer, or less literally, Mother of God. Nestorius claimed that she only bore Christ's human nature in her womb, and proposed the alternative title Christotokos, Christ-bearer or Mother of Christ. Orthodox Catholic theologians recognized that Nestorius' theory would fracture Christ into two separate persons, one human and one divine, only one of whom was in her womb. The Church reacted in 431 with the Council of Ephesus, defining that Mary could be properly referred to as the Mother of God, not in the sense that she is older than God or the source of God, but in the sense that the person she carried in her womb was in fact God incarnate. So it is, fitting that this council takes place at Ephesus, seeing as how it was a heresy against Mary and also Christ, because that's Ephesus is where Mary spent the last years of her time here on earth. So it's very fitting that that's where that heresy was settled, was at the Council of Ephesus. And so that's to give you context of who the Monophysites were. They believed that Christ had one nature, that he was half a fusion of human and divine. One person and one nature, instead of one person with a human and a divine nature that are intrinsically entwined. I think. I hope that's not wrong. So, in 529, persecution of the Monophysites ceased, and the exiles were recalled. In 532, a conference was called at Byzantium. It failed to reconcile the two parties, but Justinian did not abandon hope, though he felt it wise to publish a rescript declaring his orthodoxy in order to reassure the Pope. In 535, the Monophysites were in the ascendant. Anthemius, one of their number, was made Bishop of Constantinople, and at once got into touch with the patriarchs of Alexandria and Jerusalem. Meanwhile, John of Telos, a fiery preacher, spread Monophysite doctrines in his wanderings over Asia Minor. Monophysite monks flocked to the capital, and fashionable people would have their children baptized in Monophysite churches and entertained Monophysite chaplains at their board. The following year saw a remarkable change. The Pope Agapitus arrived in Byzantium on an embassy from the Ostrogoths. He lost no time in excommunicating Anthemius, and, supported by the Catholic party, convoked a synod which deposed him and other bishops. Justinian was induced to ratify the decision. Persecution began again. In Syria, Armenia, Mesopotamia, Monophysite monks were hunted down, starved, whipped, and burnt alive in marketplaces. John of Telos was captured and put to death with slow tortures by Ephraim, Bishop of Antioch. I don't know, that doesn't sound true. That doesn't sound real. The Pope died shortly afterwards, but his able legate, Pelagius, exercised great influence at court. Even in Egypt, temporary submission to the decisions of Chalcedon was imposed upon the cowed populace. Theodora now played a dramatic counterstroke. Rome, occupied at the moment by Belisarius, was forced to accept her nominee, the supple deacon Vigilius, as the new pope. Justinian's hopes of the unity of East and West were raised anew. The Monophysite party at Byzantium regained its lost ground, and Jacob Baradius, the strenuous Monophysite monk from whom the Jacobite Church derives its name, took up again the missionary works of John of Telos in Asia Minor, meeting with even greater success than his predecessor. Monophysite influence grew steadily from this time until the death of Theodora in 548. The culmination of the struggle was the famous affair of the Three Chapters, which lasted from 543 until 554. Apart from the intrigues connected with it, the controversy can be regarded as a stage in the long series of efforts to conciliate East and West, which began with the Henoticon of Zeno and ended with a proposed monergetic solution of Heraclius. Soon after this, the Monophysite provinces passed under Muslim domination, and the necessity for combating the separatist tendencies of Syria and Egypt ceased to exist, because they became Muslim. The means employed by the emperor in pursuit of the policy inevitable for any Byzantine ruler of political and religious unity are not without interest. Justinian opened the contest in 543 by issuing a condemnation of the Three Chapters. He hoped for the acquiescence of the Pope, but Vigilius, on his native heath, was not to be browbeaten. it was necessary to kidnap him, take him to Byzantium, and subject him to various threats and indignities before he consented in 548 to condemn the 3 chapters. The publication of his Judicatum to this effect raised a storm of protest among the bishops of Africa, Dalmatia, and Illyricum, and in 550 Justinian allowed him to withdraw the Judicatum in hopes of succeeding by less violent measures. But his hopes proving abortive, he resorted again to coercion, harrying the African bishops and ill-treating Vigilius, who was practically a prisoner in Byzantium, to the great scandal of the faithful. In 554, Vigilius, broken in health, gave way, and his second Constitutum finally condemned the 3 chapters. Justinian now endeavored to enforce his will upon the western bishoprics, but Italy proved obdurate. Vigilius was succeeded in the papal chair by Pelagius, the legate at Byzantium, who had receded somewhat from his Catholic position in order to placate Justinian. The North Italian bishops, already jealous of the encroachments of the Roman See, seized the opportunity to break off relations, and this minor schism lasted till the end of the 7th century. So what is this? I must have missed something where I'm not understanding what this 3 chapters is. Famous affair of the 3 chapters. Apart from does he not explain what the 3 chapters are? I don't think he explained. I'm not seeing where he explains what the 3 chapters are. Yeah, I don't think he has. I think he just says the 3 chapters affair, and then doesn't explain what he means by the 3 chapters. See, the Monophysite party, Monophysite influence. All right, to Google we go. Three chapters controversy. The 3 chapters controversy, a phrase of the Chalcedonian controversy, was an attempt to reconcile the non-Chalcedonians of Syria and Egypt with the Chalcedonian Christianity following the failure of the Henoticon. The 3 chapters that Emperor Justinian I anathematized were the person and writings of Theodore of Mopsuestia, certain writings of Theodoret of Cyrus, the letter of Ibas of Edessa to Maris. So, see, what are these? Theodore of Antioch. Let's see. We could just read through the background. At the very early stage of the controversy, the incriminated writings themselves came to be spoken of as the 3 chapters. In consequence, those who refused to anathematize these writings were said to defend the 3 chapters and accused of professing Nestorianism. Conversely, those who did anathematize them were said to condemn the 3 chapters as heretical. At the end of 543 or the beginning of 544, the Emperor Justinian I issued an edict in which the 3 chapters were anathematized in hope of encouraging the Oriental Orthodox to accept the decisions of the Council of Chalcedon and the tome of Pope Leo I, thus bringing religious harmony to the Byzantine Empire. You see, this is a case of an emperor overstepping his bounds, because as an emperor, he has no authority to anathematize doctrine. That is the authority of the Pope. That is the authority of the Church. And so this is a case of that Caesaropapism, or the Caesar tries to be the Pope, where he's out here trying to condemn heresy, which is not. I know nothing about these 3 chapters, but yeah, they very well could have been heretical, but it's an overstepping of his bounds of his authority, because he doesn't have the authority to anathematize and proclaim others as heretics. However, Evagrius tells us that Theodorus Askidas, the leader of the Origenists, had raised the question of the 3 chapters to divert Justinian from a persecution of his party. Okay, blah 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 blah. He doesn't wish to take revenge on the memory of Theodore of Mopsuestia, who had written much against Origen. Okay. Yeah, so it's three books that were probably considered heresy that Justinian condemned as heretical. On the whole, Justinian had failed. The East remained unreconciled. The West was subdued, but sullen and discontented. Ominous murmurs began to make themselves heard. Only Christ as king and priest, declared Facundus in Africa. The emperor should execute the canons of the church, not fix or transgress them. Yet Justinian's ideal of unity was a great one, and in an estimate of his ecclesiastical policy, one should not forget what is perhaps the most brilliant aspect of it, namely the foreign missions, which carried the faith and culture of Byzantium from Central Europe to the Far East, and created a tradition which, persisting throughout the Middle Ages, gave to the Slavs of Russia and the Balkan states a heritage of art and learning as essential to their civilization as that which the Western nation owes to Rome. Let's see how much is left of this chapter. $124. I don't think I want to read all that today. I don't know. We'll keep reading. We'll see what happens. It's another 8 pages. I normally only go for an hour on Fridays, and we're hitting about an hour. We'll read to here. We'll read to here. Go a little longer. He has some mention of Jews, so in this next section, Jewish colonies. That's always of interest to me. Not in a bad way. The combined use of commerce, missions, and diplomacy was the peculiar creation of Justinian statecraft. It is well seen in Arabia, where incidentally the Byzantine policy bears a striking resemblance to that recently used by certain great powers in the Near East. Yeah, we know exactly what you're talking about, bud. From Damascus to the Gulf of Aqaba stretched a long line of bishoprics, of which Bostra and Petra were the metropolitan sees. Then came deserts and the Red Sea coast, the Hejaz, and farther south the Himyarite country. There were many Jewish colonies here, and the Himyarites had mostly abandoned their primitive cults for the Jewish faith. Remember, this is Arabia. This is Arabia he's talking about. It's crazy that this is also where Islam gets its start. Islam gets its start in Arabia. I wonder if there's anything there that had a big effect on that. On the Persian Gulf, Christianity had gained a firm footing, having spread from Persia, where several bishoprics flourished, and had even penetrated into Yemen and Nejd. That is a strange combination of consonants there. Nejd. Nejd? The interests of Persia and Byzantium clashed in these regions, for both were interested in the coastal trade and the Indian traffic. Well before the end of the 5th century, Byzantium had reinforced her diplomatic actions. The ruler of Askum, Abyssinia, or also known as Ethiopia, was encouraged to claim the kingdom of the Himyarites. He became a Christian, and the foundation of the still existing Church of Abyssinia dates from this time. Abyssinia was actually proselytized by one of the apostles. I forget which one, but I'm pretty sure one of the apostles preached in Ethiopia. With Byzantine support, the Ascomite power extended for some years over the Himyarites, but the country was too distant for this support to prove really effective. About the year 570, Persia tired of the Byzantine intrigues and conquered the district, which until the coming of Islam was ruled by Persian deputies. In Upper Egypt, Christian missionaries played an equally important part. The Nomads, a wild tribe, were converted about 540 by a Monophysite mission, and were used as a check to their still more troublesome neighbors, the Blemmyes, who were thrown back into the desert while the Nomads took their place on the frontier. Longinus, a remarkable personality, seems to have penetrated about the year 578 on his evangelizing journeys to the upper waters of the Blue Nile. On the outposts of empire, sectarian differences are felt less strongly, and Justinian knew how to choose the best men and gave wholehearted support to Monophysite workers in this field, which he would have hesitated to bestow nearer home. The monk was an integral part of his diplomacy. At many a barbarian court, Byzantine priests became the trusted counselors of the king and obtained ascendancy over the women, eager to embrace a mystic faith, while in the train of Christianity came a new culture and a new world of ideas. More material methods were not lacking. The Berber chieftain was proud to wear the ceremonial burnous, the diadems, medals, brooches, and purple boots bestowed upon him in reward for his loyalty. Berbers, Morocco and the western part of North Africa. Part of the Sahara Desert, Libya, and Morocco. That's where the Berbers are. There's a mountain range there that they resided in. In fact, once we get into the Islamic invasions, which I don't know if he really covers, but there is a very interesting Berber queen for all of us good feminists out there. You know, there's a Berber queen who's a very interesting figure who we might get into. I don't know if he'll actually talk about her. This guy seems like he's kind of a misogynist. And the only thing I can say to misogynists is have fun madodging my fist. I'm 6'3", by the way. The king of Lazica in the Caucasus, for similar reasons, was made an officer in the imperial guard. To other rulers were given wives from the Byzantine nobility, and their sons were often sent to receive their education in the palace. Nor were the traditional Roman ways forgotten. Political exiles, rival princes, pretenders, and adventurers were encouraged to visit the capital and provided a ready excuse for Byzantine interference in the internal affairs of their countries. Lands and subsidies were bestowed with a lavish hand, and the well-tried policy of setting a thief to catch a thief was assiduously practiced. Moorish sheiks being incited against each other, Franks supported against Goths, Gepids checked by Lombards, Bulgars by Huns, and Huns by Avars. Yeah. I don't want to hear anything out of you. As far as y'all are concerned, I'm 6'3". I'm not short. I'm not short, guys. Believe me. Yeah, no, it's cooked for me, but it's fine. I forgive you. But yeah. Interesting chapter so far. The intrigues of Justinian and his organization of the kingdom. It's interesting stuff. We should finish this up on Wednesday, get to the aftermath, finish up Justinian. Ooh, Gregory the Great. Big fan. Ah, then we get to Islam. This should be interesting. Conquest of Islam. The culture of Islam. Neat. He has a lot about Islam. The Lombard invasion is kind of what I'm interested in. Because I know that they invaded, but I actually don't know much about the details of that invasion. I'm mostly interested in... Oh. I really need to get a desk microphone. I'm mostly interested in the Frankish history of it all, but let's see, 148. The Frankish history is what interests me the most, but the Lombard should be interesting too. Clash of Cultures, Constantinople, Justinian in the West, Justinian in the East, Aftermath. And then we have 3 chapters on Islam. And then we get to the greatest of all time. The greatest to ever do it. Charlemagne. European background, the Franks, the papacy, Charlemagne, Europe in transition. The good stuff. Yeah, so we got a good bit to go. We're on page 148 of the PDF, 118 in the book. So I think we're about halfway there. Let's see. The book itself goes to 242 or 266. So yeah, we're definitely over halfway there. We only got 120 pages left. And we've read about 120 pages in the past 11 streams, so yeah, about 120 pages. So another dozen streams or so, couple months. And we should be good to move on to a different book. But we will see. I could definitely take some time and get distracted by Google Earth a lot more and make this take a lot longer. But I think, yeah, that's going to be pretty much it for me. I don't know if is there anything in Google Earth we want to look at? Google Earth is always just kind of fun to scroll around and look at. Tokyo. Osaka. Here's Nagasaki. Got a nuke dropped on it. Hiroshima's in the north, right? Miyazaki? Hey, yo, he made a video game so good they named a town after him. Nagasaki's here. Hiroshima is right here. Yeah. Not. I thought it was farther north. I thought it was up here somewhere, but I was wrong. Some Russian-owned islands, right by Japan. Russia's a pretty big country. Yeah, I don't know. I ain't got much to say. All right, well, appreciate y'all coming out. Thank y'all for lending me your ear. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave a comment if y'all want to request, starting soon screen music. Be my guest. I do take requests. But I also reserve the right to tell you no. I have very eclectic taste, and if it doesn't fit into that, then I will probably say no. Yeah, but appreciate y'all coming out. Y'all have a very good night.